So for everyone listening right now, I want you to try and transport yourself back, like 6,000 years ago.
Yeah, way back into the ancient Near East.
Exactly. And, if you do that, you probably have this image in your head of like some quiet, mystical society.
Right, like Stoic philosophers just sitting around gazing thoughtfully at the stars or something.
Yeah, exactly. But that is totally wrong. If you look at the source material we're covering today, you won't find that at all.
No, not even close.
You will find an absolute, undeniable global superpower. I mean, we are talking about the ad nation.
The apex predator of the Bronze Age, really.
Yes. Imagine a society that was essentially functioning as the absolute ruler of the known world, and they were carving these massive, towering pillars straight into the high mountains.
Just staggering feats of engineering.
Totally. They were building these impenetrable, basically brutalist fortresses. I think the term in the text is Masanis.
Yeah, Masani. These massive fortified strongholds.
Right. And, they weren't building these things out of a mere need for shelter. It wasn't about staying out of the rain.
Oh, definitely not.
They were constructing them with this overwhelming, almost psychotic delusion. They literally believed that through sheer architectural and technological dominance, they had achieved physical immortality.
That's a crazy level of arrogance, honestly.
It is. So, for you listening, when you try to picture the historical realities of these architectural marvels, you have to picture the skyline of like a hyper-futuristic metropolis.
But built entirely out of solid, impossibly heavy stone.
Yes, dominating the horizon line just to terrorize anyone who even approached their territory.
It is a staggering visual, for sure. And, it completely shatters that modern arrogance we all have.
Oh, we assume ancient peoples were just primitive.
Exactly. We think they were basically living in mud huts, but they were engineering titans.
Yeah, right.
But the most profound element of this narrative, and this is where our deep dive into the source material really begins today, is how the arrival of a single social reformer completely reframes all that grandeur.
Yeah, it completely flips the script.
It really does. So today we are looking deeply into the structural analysis of Surah Hud, specifically focusing on the confrontation outlined in Ayat 50 through 53.
And the stakes here are massive.
Huge. And the core analytical framework we're using, which is often associated with the groundbreaking analysis of scholar Ghulam Ahmed Parwez, is this absolute pivot in perspective.
The Parwezian point, basically.
Right, the Parwezian point. The Prophet Hud was sent right into the beating heart of this superpower.
Like right into the capital city.
Exactly. And he was entirely, almost aggressively unimpressed by their architecture.
Which is wild, right? Like you walk into Rome at its height and you're just like, whatever.
Yeah, he wasn't awed by their technological prowess at all. He basically walked right past the towering stone monuments.
Ignored the massive military fortifications.
Ignored all of it. And he put a magnifying glass straight to their social ethics.
Oh, man.
He essentially stood before the elites of the greatest empire on earth and delivered this totally devastating verdict. He basically told them, your pillars are high, but your values are incredibly low.
Your pillars are high, but your values are low. Wow. You can just feel the weight of that.
It's a surgical strike on their civilizational ego.
It really is. And that actually brings us to the exact mission of our deep dive today. We are breaking down this very specific high-stakes confrontation.
Right.
But, for you listening right now, you need to understand that this is not just some dusty history lesson about a vanished tribe in the desert.
No, not at all.
What we are looking at is a definitive forensic blueprint for civilizational collapse.
A terrifyingly precise breakdown, really.
Exactly. It shows exactly how highly advanced societies, even those with, immense scientific understanding and booming economies, how they inevitably shatter.
Because they always do.
Right. And they shatter the exact moment they prioritize elite vanity and brutal wealth accumulation over human utility and fundamental social ethics.
We are dealing with the geopolitics of truth today.
The geopolitics of truth. I love that framing. So let's get into it.
Well, to truly grasp the mechanics of that collapse, you have to first understand the absolute height of their supremacy.
Right. You have to understand the engine that powered the ad nation.
Exactly. They possessed immense wealth, obviously, but more importantly, they possessed staggering scientific advancement.
It wasn't just magic to them, it was science.
Right. And the linguistic and epistemological terms used in the source text to describe their intelligence are incredibly specific.
Let's break those down.
Sure. The text says they possessed Sama, Basar, and Fuad.
Sama, Basar, and Fuad.
Yeah. And in a literal surface-level translation, that's just hearing, sight, and intellect.
Right, which, I mean, hearing, sight, and intellect just sound like the baseline requirements to be a functioning human being, right? Like, if I have functioning ears and eyes, I'm not suddenly a global superpower, so it has to mean more than that.
Oh, it means something much, much more robust in the context of civilizational development. It represents the complete mastery of the empirical method.
The empirical method, like the scientific method.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Sima and Basar, so hearing and sight, represent the meticulous gathering of observational data.
Okay, so they weren't just looking at things, they were observing them.
Right. They were actively observing the laws of physics, the movement of the stars, the properties of different building materials.
Like hard science.
Hard science. They weren't just passively experiencing the world, they were measuring it.
Got it.
And then you have Fuad. This represents the cognitive processing power.
The intellect.
Right? The active intellect that takes all that raw empirical data, analyzes it, and synthesizes it into technical scientific knowledge.
So they were essentially ancient data scientists and engineers.
Absolutely. They had mastered the physical sciences of their era.
Yeah.
They understood advanced engineering, complex metallurgy, architectural load-bearing.
You need all that to carve a mountain.
You do, and massive-scale logistics, too. They had literally harnessed the forces of nature to bend the physical world to their will.
But see, this is where the truly chilling part comes in, and this is where the critique from HUD gets incredibly sharp.
Yeah, it does.
Because despite having the FUAD, this massive intellect to engineer these jaw-dropping monuments, those massive pillars and fortresses had absolutely zero utility value. Zero. And utility value is a phrase we really need to sit with today.
It's the crux of the issue.
Because they weren't using their engineering genius to, build aqueducts to bring fresh water to drought-stricken villages.
No.
They weren't designing mass housing to shelter the vulnerable people in their society.
Not at all.
They were building pure, unadulterated vanity projects. They were literally carving their names into the highest mountains just to assert geographical dominance.
To psychologically crush neighboring nations.
Right, and to feed their own delusion of permanence. It was basically architecture functioning as psychological warfare.
That's a great way to put it. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of Istighfar.
Istighfar. What does that mean exactly in this context?
It translates roughly to arrogance without right.
Arrogance without right. Okay.
It's the belief that basically, because you possess the technical capacity to build the biggest structures or the most devastating weapons, you inherently possess the moral right to dominate everyone else.
Oh, wow. Right, Manx right, basically.
Exactly. They equated technological superiority with moral supremacy.
Which is a fatal flaw.
Right. But as you highlighted, there was no mana fiu and lanus in any of this.
Mana fiulinus.
Yeah, which translates to benefit to humanity.
Okay, benefit to humanity.
The source text insists that a civilization's true worth is measured solely by its utility to the human condition.
And the Ed Nation had none of that.
They produce negative utility. And think about the cost. To fund these massive, utterly pointless vanity projects, these stone fortresses in the sky, they required a staggering amount of capital.
And resources.
And most importantly, cheap labor.
Which, necessitates a completely brutal social hierarchy. I mean, you cannot build a zero-utility mega project without an endless supply of expendable bodies.
You really can't.
And the social structure of the Ad Nation was entirely defined by a ruthless, violently enforced class divide. It was based purely on wealth, color, and lineage.
A total caste system.
Yeah. The elites at the absolute top viewed the lower classes, the laborers actually building the pillars, as subhuman. The word used in the text is kameen, right?
Right. Kameen, meaning mean or lowly or wretched.
Wretched, man. And the elites, they were wrapped in their luxury, and they refused to even share physical space with these laborers.
They wouldn't even sit with them.
But it wasn't just, passive snobbery. It wasn't just them being elite and out of touch. To extract the labor necessary to build those pillars, the state utilized what the text calls the grip of steel.
Yes. Batashtum. This is a critical concept.
Tell me about Batashtum.
It represents the brute force of a highly militarized, hyper-extractive state apparatus.
So state-sponsored violence.
Exactly. The ad didn't just passively maintain their wealth. They actively terrorized their own population to secure it.
Wow.
They squeezed the resources, the vitality, and literal blood out of their own lower classes to mix into the mortar of their strong foundations.
That's horrifying.
And it gets worse. When they exhausted their domestic supply of wealth and labor, they launched these brutal imperialistic expeditions against weaker neighboring nations.
Just to strip mine their resources.
Just to strip mine them. The entire global economy of their time was designed to funnel wealth upwards into the hands of a microscopic elite, and it was maintained entirely by the constant looming threat of the grip of steel.
You know, I think we really need to draw a very sharp line to the present day right here.
I agree.
Because for anyone listening to this societal blueprint should feel incredibly uncomfortably familiar.
You really should.
I mean, think about the modern ultra-elites today. We live in a world where billionaires are funneling unimaginable resources into building vanity mega yachts.
Mega yachts that are the size of military destroyers.
Literally.
Yeah.
And we have these private, ego-driven space races where unfathomable amounts of capital are just burned so an elite can experience like 4 minutes of weightlessness.
While ignoring the problems on the ground.
Exactly. All of this is happening while systemic poverty beneath them expands, while basic infrastructure crumbles, and while working classes are squeezed harder and harder just to afford basic survival.
It is the exact same blueprint.
Isn't it? You have the Sama, Basar, Fuad, the brilliant scientific intellect required to engineer a reusable rocket or like a high-frequency trading algorithm.
Right.
But you have absolutely zero social utility value in the application of that brilliance. We are literally still building the high pillars of ad today.
That parallel is precisely what the historical analysis demands you confront.
It forces you to look in the mirror.
It does, because scientific knowledge, without moral values, without being tethered to objective, divine ethical laws, is basically a mathematical guarantee of civilizational death.
Wow, a mathematical guarantee.
It is a fundamental law in the geopolitics of truth. If a society develops immense technical capacity, but completely divorces that capacity from social ethics and human utility.
Which is exactly what ad did.
Right. That society will inevitably use its advanced technology to oppress, to extract, and ultimately to cannibalize itself.
It eats itself.
Exactly. The ad nation had the empirical data. They had the towering intellect. But they lacked the ethical compass to direct that intelligence toward anything other than their own self-glorification and, honestly, bottomless greed.
Okay, but I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least I want to explore the cognitive dissonance of these ad elites.
Okay, let's do it.
Because this is the part that always fascinates me about highly educated, highly capable people driving themselves off a cliff.
Right, the paradox.
Yeah. If they were so incredibly intelligent, if they had this highly developed fuad, this intellect capable of mastering physics and structural engineering, how could they not see that their social foundation was rotting?
The great question.
I mean, think about it structurally. An engineer knows perfectly well that you cannot build a 10-ton roof on crumbling, decaying walls.
Right. It violates basic physics.
Exactly. So how does an entire society of brilliant intellectuals completely miss the basic logic of social and economic decay?
Well, that is the most tragic, fatal paradox of the human intellect. And it is the exact mechanism that leads to the downfall of advanced civilizations.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The intellect, the FUAD, is an incredibly powerful engine. It's essentially a supercomputer.
Right.
But an engine is entirely directionless on its own.
Yeah.
It only serves whatever master happens to be holding the steering wheel.
Okay, that makes sense.
In the case of the ad elites, their powerful intellect was hijacked and enslaved by their desires, their greed, their lust for power, what the text calls their hawa.
Hawa. So the intellect basically becomes a hostage to the ego.
Actually, it's worse than a hostage.
Oh.
It becomes a willing accomplice.
Oh, wow.
When desire and raw greed take the wheel, the intellect is no longer tasked with finding the objective truth. It is tasked only with rationalizing, optimizing, and justifying that greed.
Oh, I see. So the engineer isn't asking the right questions.
Exactly. The intellect of an ad engineer doesn't stop to ask, hey, is it morally justifiable to crush the poor, displace communities, and starve children just to build this vanity palace?
It never asks that.
Never. It only asks what is the most mathematically efficient way to crush them so we can get the palace built under budget.
That is deeply unsettling.
Therefore, despite their massive scientific knowledge, they were utterly functionally blind to their impending social collapse.
Because their metrics were completely skewed.
Right. Their entire dashboard, Their metrics for civilizational success were based exclusively on wealth accumulation and military dominance.
GDP and military spending.
Exactly. They didn't measure stability, they didn't measure justice, and so they didn't see the collapse coming until the walls literally gave way.
That is a terrifying thought for anyone looking at modern society, because it means that technological brilliance, rather than saving a society, can actually act as a highly polished mask for deep systemic ethical decay.
It hides the rot.
Right. The engine is running faster, the technology is getting sleeker, the GDP numbers look fantastic on paper, but the steering wheel is locked and the entire vehicle is speeding directly toward a cliff.
Exactly.
And when a trajectory is that profoundly broken, when the corruption is built into the very code of the society, you can't just fix it with a slight policy tweak, right? Or like a marginal tax adjustment.
No, minor reforms won't do anything at that stage.
You need a massive systemic intervention. You need to pull the emergency brake on the entire civilization. Enter the course corrector, the Prophet Hud.
Yes, exactly. And to really understand the magnitude of this intervention, we have to look deeply into the linguistic reality of who Hud was.
Let's do a linguistic deep dive here.
Okay. The name Hud itself is not just a historical label. It carries an immense linguistic weight.
What does it mean?
It is intrinsically tied to the concept of returning or correcting course.
Correcting course. Wow.
This is the crux of the matter. Hud's mission was not merely to show up in the capital city, gather a few followers in a quiet corner, and offer them a new set of personal, private, religious rituals.
Right, just to make them feel better about their oppression.
Exactly. His mission was a total, radical, unyielding correction of the national trajectory.
So he wasn't there to act as a spiritual life coach for the elites?
Definitely not.
He didn't want to teach them how to meditate in their sky palaces. He was standing in the public square, pointing at their economy, their justice system, and their labor practices, and demanding they dismantle it all.
He was attacking the very operating system of their empire.
That is incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. And you have to understand the staggering psychological toll of that kind of mission.
I can only imagine.
Historical and analytical traditions regarding this specific narrative note something incredibly profound. The message contained in these verses, the sheer crushing weight of this revolutionary stroke, and the terrifying clash of civilizations was so heavy that it is said to have physically aged the prophet.
Physically aged him. Wow. I want you, the listener, to really imagine that for a second. Imagine the psychological terror of standing completely alone against a global superpower.
It's unfathomable.
You have no army, you have no wealth, you have zero political backing. You are staring down a hyper-militarized state that uses the grip of steel to crush whole nations.
Right.
And you are looking them dead in the eye and demanding that they voluntarily surrender their power, dismantle their economic engine, and submit to an objective ethical law.
The stress of that, the utter isolation of that would turn your hair white.
It would age you decades in a matter of months.
Because he wasn't just asking them to change their minds. He was demanding they destroy their gods.
Destroy their gods.
He demanded that they serve only the divine ethical law and completely abandon their alihat.
Alihat.
Yes. Now, we need to be very careful here because historically, we have profoundly misunderstood what alihat means in this specific context.
How so?
Usually, when modern people hear the word idols, we picture like primitive, ignorant people bowing down to stone statues of rain gods or fertility goddesses.
Right. We think of it as a quaint, silly superstition.
Exactly. But a highly advanced, mathematically brilliant society like Ad wasn't being driven by a fear of stone statues. The structural analysis totally shatters that simplistic view.
Yes, and this is where the geopolitics of the text really bear their teeth, because these idols were not inanimate blocks of stone.
No, they were not.
They were the muftarin,
The false invention.
the false inventions. These idols were the systemic centers of power. They were the elite corporate monopolies, the oppressive economic systems.
The cultural hierarchies that justified the extreme inequality.
Right. And the militarized state apparatus that utilized that grip of steel. Those were the real idols.
That is what the society actually worshipped.
Because that is where the power, the capital, and the security actually flowed. Worshipping an idol in this context means submitting your life, your labor, and your morality to a corrupt system.
It is institutional idolatry.
Institutional idolatry. That's a powerful phrase.
The elites themselves acted as the gods of this system, dictating who lived, who died, who starved, and who thrived.
Playing God.
Exactly. And Hud was bringing a concept that was utterly lethal to that framework.
Lethal how?
Well, the structural analysis uses a brilliant metaphor here. It describes these oppressive systems, these massive power structures where elites play God as giant ice sculptures.
I am absolutely obsessed with this metaphor, but we really have to push it to its logical conclusion to understand it.
Let's do it.
An ice sculpture looks incredibly imposing, right? It looks permanent.
They're very solid.
And if you light it with the artificial neon lights of their own vanity and propaganda, it looks like it's carved from indestructible diamond. It feels like it will last forever.
It's an illusion of permanence.
Exactly. But the metaphor insists that when the sun of truth shines, when true, unyielding, objective ethical law is brought to bear, these massive, terrifying structures of power simply melt away.
They just dissolve.
They are revealed to have absolutely no substance at all. They're just frozen water, temporarily holding a shape.
Because they violate the fundamental laws of human existence.
Right.
A society built on extreme oppression and zero utility is inherently unstable. It requires massive amounts of artificial energy, the grip of steel, just to maintain its shape.
To keep the ice frozen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once you expose it to the heat of objective truth, the energy required to maintain the lie becomes unsustainable and the structure just collapses.
The heat of truth.
HUD is bringing the heat of objective ethical truth to a society that is entirely reliant on the cold, rigid structures of exploitation.
But, let's take that ice sculpture metaphor a step further. Because melting ice doesn't just disappear, it turns into water.
True.
And if you have a massive societal-level ice sculpture melting rapidly, you don't just get a puddle, you get a catastrophic flood.
A massive deluge.
Historically, when deeply entrenched power structures melt down, the resulting chaos usually drowns the most vulnerable people first.
Flatly, yes.
The elites might lose their palaces, but the lower classes are the ones swept away in the floodwaters of economic collapse or civil war.
It's collateral damage.
Right. So when HUD initiates this process, he must know the immense danger involved. But he proceeds anyway, because the slow, grinding death of the status quo is worse than the acute pain of the cure.
That is the grim calculus of true reform. The disease is terminal, so the surgery must be radical.
Radical surgery.
But let's analyze this confrontation from the perspective of the ad elites for a second. Put yourself in their position.
Okay, let's do some role play. Let's step into the incredibly wealthy, bespoke shoes of an ad oligarch for a second.
Okay, you're the oligarch.
I am looking at the dashboard of my empire. My GDP is booming. We are posting record profits every single quarter.
Your technology is unmatched.
Unmatched across the known globe. My military is terrifying and undefeated. I literally live in a stone palace above the clouds.
Life is good.
Life is great. And then a single individual stands up in the public square and tells me that my entire civilizational model is a catastrophic failure and requires immediate course correction.
How do you react?
From my perspective, the course looks fantastic.
Right.
Everything is working exactly as it was designed to work for me.
Right.
Why on earth would I ever listen to this guy? How does HUD even begin to pierce that level of institutionalized, mathematically justified delusion?
That is the defining question for any reformer, whistleblower, or dissident facing a deeply entrenched, highly successful power structure.
It seems impossible.
If you try to fight them using their own metrics, if you try to outspend them, outmaneuver them politically, or match their military power, you will be crushed instantaneously.
Because they own the board.
They own the board, they own the pieces, and they wrote the rules of the game.
So what's the strategy?
To pierce the delusion of a ruling class, the reformer must wield a weapon that the elite cannot buy, cannot co-opt, cannot intimidate, and fundamentally cannot understand.
What is that weapon?
When we look closely at Ayat 51, we see exactly what it is. It is absolute, unshakable, terrifying financial independence.
Financial independence. This is the engine of reason.
Yes.
Let's look at the exact wording of Ayat 51, where HUD delivers his non-negotiable opening condition.
It's a brilliant move.
He looks at the assembled elites of the empire and declares, I ask no reward for this.
I ask no reward for this.
It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? It sounds like a humble throwaway line from a pious guy.
But it's not.
No. If you analyze the mechanics of power, this statement is the absolute bedrock of a true social reformer. It is the one thing the system cannot handle.
Because it short-circuits the brutal logic of systemic power. Think about how empires control dissent. If you are a critic of the system, but you are on the payroll of the elite, if you rely on their university grants, their media platforms, their political endorsements, or their corporate funding to survive.
Right, you're compromised.
Your survival is inextricably linked to the very system you claim you want to reform.
You can't bite the hand that feeds you.
You might be allowed to critique the system around the edges. You might be permitted to ask for minor concessions or slight improvements in working conditions.
A little raise here, a day off there.
But you will never, ever demand the melting of the ice sculptures, because you are living comfortably inside the ice palace. Your paycheck depends on the ice staying frozen.
There is a quote, Upton Sinclair, I think. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
That quote has literally never been more applicable.
It's so true. You cannot bite the hand that writes your paycheck. And the elites know this intuitively. They buy out their critics constantly.
It's their standard playbook.
They absorb them into the system. They give the loudest dissident a book deal, a board seat, and a comfortable salary, and suddenly the dissident's revolutionary fire turns into, like, a polite request for gradual reform.
Co-option is cheaper than suppression.
Exactly. But HUD steps into the center of the empire and essentially says, I don't want your money. I don't want a seat on your corporate board. I don't want a political appointment. I don't want to be the new king.
And by doing so, he establishes an unbreakable intellectual high ground.
He completely disarms them.
He links this directly to the concept of afala takilun.
Afala takilun. Let's dig into that.
It translates to, will you not use your intellect?
Will you not use your intellect?
This is a massive pivotal point in the confrontation. Notice that HUD is not standing there demanding blind, emotional, irrational faith.
He's not doing a tent revival.
No. He isn't asking them to just believe him because he feels very strongly about it. He is offering them a rigorous, airtight, logical proof.
Using their own metrics against them.
Exactly. He is challenging their highly developed fuad, that immense intellect they are so arrogant about.
He's saying, be logical about this.
He is saying, use your empirical observation. Examine my motives. I have no profit motive. I have no hidden agenda to extract wealth from you. I have no desire to replace you as the new oppressive elite.
I'm not running for office.
Right. Therefore, since I have absolutely nothing personal to gain and everything to lose by standing against you, you must logically conclude that what I am speaking is the objective truth.
I want to give you, the listener, a modern thought experiment to make this really visceral.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a massive, globally dominant corporation. Let's say they are secretly dumping highly toxic chemicals into the local water supply of a poor town just to save on waste disposal costs.
Okay, classic corporate malfeasance.
Right. Now, the CEO knows the EPA is sniffing around, so he hires an internal auditor, someone on the corporate payroll, to review their environmental impact.
Conflict of interest immediately.
Exactly. That auditor's salary, their end-of-year bonus, their entire career trajectory, is completely controlled by the CEO.
Yep.
So when that auditor inevitably produces a glossy 500-page report saying everything is fine, the water is perfectly safe, absolutely nobody with a functioning brain believes it. The conflict of interest is neon lit.
The profit motive totally invalidates the conclusion.
Exactly. But now, imagine an entirely independent scientist,
Okay.
someone who cannot be fired by the CEO, someone who publicly refuses any consulting fees, any grant money, any speaking engagements from this corporation.
Uncompromised.
Uncompromised. When that independent scientist publishes a 10-page report proving the water is poison, that report has terrifying, earth-shattering power.
Because there's no angle.
Right. The corporation can't just dismiss it as a competitor's smear campaign, and they can't buy the scientist off. Financial independence is the ultimate armor of truth. It is the only thing that makes the truth bulletproof against a corrupt system.
That is a flawless analogy, really. And it perfectly aligns with how ancient, hyper-capitalist societies react to uncompromised truth.
How did they react?
When you study the sociological phenomenon of dissent in these deeply extractive empires, you see a really consistent pattern.
Okay.
When an individual acts entirely without a profit motive, when they dedicate their labor purely for the benefit of humanity, for manafia linnas,
Yeah.
the society doesn't just disagree with them. The society labels them as crazy. The term is majnoon.
Majnoon. And they don't mean crazy as an insult, do they?
No, they mean it as a literal clinical diagnosis.
Because the existence of someone who doesn't want money literally breaks their brains.
Precisely. A mindset that is entirely structurally based on profit, exploitation, and zero-sum accumulation simply cannot compute selfless action.
It doesn't fit in their algorithm.
To the elites of bad, every single human interaction is a transaction. Everyone has a price. Every favor is an investment.
Quid pro quo, always.
Always. If you do something, you are doing it to gain power, wealth, or status. That is the only operating system they know.
So when HUD comes along.
Right. When HUD stands up, demands a total, agonizing restructuring of their entire society, risks his own life to do it, and then flatly refuses any payment or power in return. It creates a massive cognitive dissonance.
He doesn't fit into their transactional matrix.
They cannot map his behavior onto their understanding of the world.
He's basically a glitch in the matrix, and the system has to quarantine the glitch.
Exactly. Their only psychological defense mechanism is to label him Majnun insane.
It's self-preservation.
Because if they admit that he is sane, and if they admit that he is acting purely out of a dedication to ethical truth and human utility,
oh, then the whole house of cards falls.
then they would have to admit that their entire worldview, their entire justification for the grip of steel and the extreme poverty of the lower classes is completely flawed.
They would have to admit that they are the villains of the story.
Exactly. Labeling him insane is a survival mechanism for their own egos.
So let's look at the chessboard right now.
Okay, let's survey the board.
HUD has completely backed the Bronze Age superpower into a logical corner.
Checkmate, intellectually.
He has presented an uncompromised, objective ethical model. He has powered it by pure reason, challenging their afala takilun. He has shielded it with absolute financial and political independence.
He's impenetrable.
He's basically begging them to use that massive intellect they are so proud of to see the mathematical reality of their impending collapse.
Right.
But, as history shows us time and time again, when an oppressive superpower is backed into a logical corner, they rarely just throw up their hands and concede.
Never.
The CEO doesn't read the independent water report and say, you know what, you're right, let's liquidate the company and go to jail.
That has never happened in history.
They don't dismantle the empire voluntarily. Instead, they retreat. And the text shows us exactly where they retreat to. The ultimate intellectual safe space.
Right.
When logic threatens their power, they run straight to the past.
Which brings us to the fascinating mechanics of social physics, outlined in Ayat 52 and 53.
Tell me about this.
After being presented with this unassailable logic and a clear demand to align their massive resources with divine ethical law, the elites of Ad give their official, formal response in Ayat 53.
The official response of the superpower, what is it?
They look at HUD and declare, "You brought no clear proof, and we won't leave what our fathers worshipped."
We won't leave what our fathers worship.
That's their defense.
I want to pause here because this response is so historically fascinating and honestly so intellectually pathetic.
It's incredibly weak.
Remember who we are talking about here. This is a society at the absolute bleeding edge of scientific advancement. They are the masters of the physical universe.
They measure the stars.
They engineer impossible structures. They operate on empirical data. And yet, when faced with a structural critique of their economy and their ethics, their ultimate final defense is, because our grandfathers did it this way.
It is mind-boggling.
It is. We are witnessing a fundamental conflict of models here. The static model versus the dynamic model.
Let's break down the mechanics of those two models,
Yeah.
because they literally govern every civilizational conflict in human history.
Okay, the static model first.
The static model is exactly what it sounds like. It relies on blind adherence to ancestry, unquestioned tradition, and maintaining the status quo at all costs.
Just keeping things the way they are.
It operates on the premise that a system, a hierarchy, or an economic model is valid simply because it is old and because previous generations engaged in it.
Nostalgia as policy.
Exactly. It requires absolutely no critical thought, no empirical observation of its current effects on society, only strict imitation.
Right.
The dynamic model, which HUD is representing, is the exact opposite. It is based on reason, active intellect, and strict adherence to objective divine ethical law.
Constant evaluation.
Yes. It assumes that society must be constantly evaluated, critiqued, and realigned toward justice and human utility. If a system is hurting people today, it doesn't matter if your grandfather invented it. The dynamic model demands that it be dismantled.
And the elites completely reject the dynamic model.
Completely.
But wait, I have to push back here again, because this introduces a massive contradiction that we need to untangle for the listener.
All right, what's the contradiction?
You spent the first half of this deep dive explaining how scientifically advanced they were. They had a highly developed fuad. They used the empirical method.
Yes, they did.
Normally, we associate advanced science with progressivism. We think of scientific societies as constantly moving forward, breaking old dogmas, and disrupting the status quo.
That's the modern assumption, yes.
So why would a society that relies so heavily on technical facts, engineering, and empirical data suddenly fall back on the ancestry trap? Why retreat to the most unscientific argument possible? Because tradition dictates it.
That is the absolute brilliance of the critique within the text. It exposes the hypocrisy of selective rationality.
Selective rationality, okay.
The reason they fall back on the ancestry trap is because, as we discussed earlier, technical knowledge without moral alignment inevitably bows to self-interest.
It's that hijacked intellect again.
Yes. You have to separate their methodology in the physical sciences from their methodology in social ethics.
Okay, so two different approaches.
In building a fortress, they use rigorous observation and logic because the laws of physics are neutral. Physics doesn't care if you are rich or poor. If you build a bad arch, it collapses.
Gravity doesn't take bribes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in structuring their society, if they were to use that same rigorous observation and logic, they would have to admit that their system was unjust, extractive, and mathematically unsustainable.
They'd have to audit themselves?
They would have to look at the poverty of the laborers and mathematically trace it back to their own hoarded wealth.
Ah, I see. Logic and empirical data become incredibly dangerous when they are pointed directly at the elite's bank accounts.
Bingo. When logic threatens their privilege, they immediately abandon logic.
Yeah.
The intellect becomes blind, deaf, and dumb the very moment it is asked to audit its own greed.
That is so cynical.
It is. They didn't cling to what our fathers worshipped because they had some deep philosophical reverence for ancient history or like a tender love for their ancestors.
That's just a cover story.
That is a very naive reading of the text. The ancestry trap was just a highly effective, emotionally resonant excuse.
It's a shield.
It's an impenetrable shield. They clung to the traditions of their fathers because those specific traditions were the exact mechanisms that guaranteed their current systemic privilege.
The traditions were the pipelines of wealth.
The ancestry trap allows them to completely avoid the terrifying prospect of redistributing power and wealth while masking their greed as respect for heritage.
Think about how this mechanism works in practice. How does a ruling class enforce the ancestry trap?
They build an infrastructure around it.
Right, they don't just ask nicely, they build an entire apparatus around it. They control the historical narrative.
They embed this tradition into their educational systems.
Teaching the youth that the grip of steel is just the natural divine order of the universe.
And they utilize cultural shame to enforce it.
Exactly. They ensure that anyone who questions the economic disparity is branded a traitor to their own heritage. We can't change the economic system, HUD. We can't stop squeezing the poor. This is how our glorious ancestors built this great nation. You're attacking our history.
This is the ultimate cop-out.
It weaponizes nostalgia to protect inequality. And look closely at how they phrase their rejection in Ayat 53. You brought no clear proof.
Yes, the demand for clear proof.
The text highlights that they demand what is called a bayina,
A bayina.
which in their context means a supernatural miracle. They want a magic trick.
They want a spectacle.
They want HUD to make a giant camel jump out of a solid rock. Or they want him to summon a lightning bolt from a clear sky. Why? Because they absolutely refuse to engage with his actual intellectual, economic, and social arguments.
The demand for a supernatural miracle is one of the most classic, documented evasion tactics used by corrupt power structures.
How so?
It is a brilliant bad faith maneuver. Think about it. If HUD is arguing for social justice, if he is providing a detailed critique of economic fairness and the unsustainability of oppressive power structures,
Right.
the proof of his message is in the logic of the message itself.
The proof is in the pudding.
The empirical proof is that a society built on justice survives and thrives, and a society built on extraction and oppression eventually collapses under its own weight. That is the bayina.
The logic is the proof.
Exactly. But the elites don't want to debate economics, sociology, or ethics because they know they will lose that debate on the merits.
So they change the rules of engagement.
They demand a magic trick. They say, unless you can violate the physical laws of nature right in front of us, we won't listen to a single word you say about the ethical laws of society.
It is intellectual cowardice masquerading as rigorous skepticism.
That's exactly what it is.
Let me give you another modern parallel.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a climate scientist who is presenting decades of peer-reviewed data, temperature logs, and atmospheric models proving that the global temperature is rising at a dangerous rate.
Okay.
And a corrupt politician funded by the fossil fuel industry looks at the scientist and says, well, if global warming is real, prove it by making it snow in my office right now in the middle of July. You can't. I guess you have no clear proof.
It's an impossible bad faith demand.
It is an absurd, childish demand designed purely to dismiss the messenger so they can comfortably ignore the message.
Right.
And by doing this, by willfully demanding magic instead of engaging with reason, the text implies a horrific consequence. They have rendered themselves worse than animals.
That's a strong statement, but the text supports it.
Because an animal operates purely on instinct, right? It doesn't know any better.
It's just surviving.
But a human being who possesses an incredibly advanced fuad, who understands logic and cause and effect, and who willfully, intentionally shuts that intellect off just to protect their own greed and systemic privilege.
That human has fundamentally degraded their own nature.
They've broken their own operating system.
The tragedy of the Ad Nation, as mapped out in this deep dive into the source material, is precisely that willful, arrogant degradation.
They weren't victims of circumstance.
Not at all. They had every single tool necessary to build an eternal, deeply just, flourishing civilization.
They had the raw wealth.
They had the massive perceptual data.
They had the unmatched engineering capacity.
But they made a conscious, calculated choice. They chose the static model of oppression over the dynamic model of justice.
They chose the comfortable, profitable illusion of the ancestry trap over the harsh, demanding reality of objective ethical law.
They chose to be gods over a broken people, rather than servants to a just system.
Wow. So the lines are officially drawn in the sand.
The negotiation phase is officially over.
The intellectual debate has been shut down. The appeal to reason, the demand for afala takalun has completely failed.
They wouldn't use their intellect.
The superpower has flat out, unequivocally rejected the course corrector. They have labeled his absolute independence as insanity.
Called him Mejnun.
They have demanded cheap magic tricks to avoid an economic audit. And they have hidden cowardly behind the skirts of their ancestors to protect their bank accounts.
They're doubling down.
They are gripping the steering wheel, flooring the accelerator, and heading straight for the cliff, fully confident that their grip of steel and their zero-utility vanity projects will somehow save them from gravity.
Which perfectly sets the stage for a dramatic, almost incomprehensible escalation in the narrative.
It really does.
And while we're focusing on verses 50 through 53 today, the source material gives us a vital, thrilling teaser for the verses that immediately follow, Ayat 54 through 60.
Right. We aren't going to dissect those verses today, but we absolutely have to look ahead because the psychological tension here is just unbearable.
It's a massive cliffhanger.
If you are reading this as a strategic geopolitical manual, you would think that at this exact moment, when one solitary man standing against a heavily militarized, hyper-wealthy, violently oppressive global empire is officially and finally rejected.
The logical survivalist move is to run.
Right. The rational move is to slip out of the city gates under the cover of night, disappear into the desert, and just hope the grip of steel doesn't find you.
That is what human instinct dictates.
It's what anyone would do.
But that is not what HUD does.
Not even close. The source reveals HUD's next move, and it is staggeringly, almost terrifyingly bold.
It's wild.
He doesn't back down an inch. He doesn't soften his message to appease them. He doesn't look for a compromise.
No half measures.
He stands in the center of the capital, looks at the assembled might of the Bronze Age superpower. He looks at the billionaire elites, the military commanders who enforce the grip of steel, the brilliant engineers who built the high pillars.
And he issues a massive, sweeping, suicidal challenge.
Suicidal is the right word. He tells the entire empire, every single one of them, to all plot against me together.
Plot against me together.
And he tells them to do it without delay. Give me no respite. Bring the grip of steel. Bring everything you have.
It is the ultimate cinematic expression of the total independence we discussed earlier.
He's practically taunting them.
He has systematically stripped them of their intellectual defenses, he has exposed their ancestry trap as a fraud, and now he is inviting their total unrestrained physical wrath, seemingly entirely unprotected.
And it leaves you with these massive, lingering cliffhanger questions that really define the geopolitics of truth.
Questions we'll explore next time.
Like, how does one single, unarmed man stand in the public square and challenge a global superpower to do its absolute worst?
What is his leverage?
Exactly. What ultimate unshakable force is he relying on when every single ounce of earthly, political, financial, and military power is arrayed against him?
It forces the listener to confront the ultimate reality of unseen power versus seen power.
Seen versus unseen.
The Ad Nation relied entirely on the seen. The massive stone fortresses, the hoarded wealth, the physical weapons.
The pillars.
Right. HUD is relying entirely on the unseen, the immutable, dynamic, unbroken laws of ethical truth.
The objective laws of the universe.
The text poses the ultimate question. When the storm of consequence finally arrives, which foundation is actually stronger? The stone pillars built on oppression or the unseen laws of justice?
And that tension, that exact question, is not trapped in the ancient sands of the Near East.
No, it's playing out right now.
The blueprint of Ad is terrifyingly, urgently relevant today. So I want to leave you, yes, you, the listener, whether you are driving to work, sitting at your desk, or walking outside, I want to leave you with a profound thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
A final reflection.
Think about the structures, the systems, or even the personal empires you are interacting with or building today.
We all have our own projects.
In our own lives, in our careers, in our modern corporate structures, or in the political policies we support, we are all, in some way, building our own versions of tall pillars.
We are all chasing success, stability, and permanence.
But look closely, brutally closely, at the foundation of what you are building.
What's it made of?
Are you relying on the static, self-serving models of the past? Are you using your own fuad, your own brilliant intellect, just to rationalize your own greed?
Are you hiding behind the ancestry trap?
Exactly. Saying things like, well, this is just how business is done, or this is how the industry works.
Or are your pillars aligned with a dynamic, unyielding ethical truth?
Are you building a model that actually possesses genuine human utility value? Manafiyu, Linus?
That is the ultimate metric the analysis demands we use. You must rigorously evaluate the utility value of the monuments you're building with your life.
Exactly, because as the Ad Nation found out the hard way, it does not matter how technologically advanced your algorithms are, how high your GDP climbs, or how impenetrable you build your stone towers.
None of it matters.
If your foundational values are rotting in the muddy, toxic waters of exploitation and vanity, eventually the sun of truth is going to shine.
And when it does, the ice sculptures are going to melt.
Think about what kind of flood you're leaving behind.